morning, and you're very welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to our Soil Fertility Conference. This conference is one of a series of conferences planned for this year to support advisors and agri-professionals across a range of environmental issues that are growing in importance in the day-to-day work of advisors. We began the series with a conference on water quality at the beginning of the month. We have a number of others. We're hoping to have one on the uplands and the cooperation projects in the early summer, a biodiversity one in September, and a gaseous emissions conference in November. So providing, I suppose, support to ye as advisors and industry professionals right across the spectrum of environmental challenges. The original plan for this conference was to have it towards the end of the year, but I think we got feedback from a number of people to say, listen, the challenges in relation to soil fertility, fertiliser application, nutrient management in general, just so big at the moment that it really needs to be dealt with early in the year before advisors are working with farmers. We're conscious of the workload and the fact that many of you will have already been to our conference in Tullamore. So we decided to, I suppose, mix up our mode of delivery and to have this one online. So I'm looking forward to presenting 3 sessions over the next 3 Monday mornings. I hope this will be a useful and timely update for you. Just to note, we would appreciate any feedback you can give us in relation to this conference and other conferences. During the session, we will use the Q&A to direct questions to the participants. So joining us today in terms of presentations, I'll do a quick presentation to highlight, I suppose, the challenges that are there, and then we'll be followed by Tim Hyde and David Wall. Noel, Meehan will be chairing the session, and Seamus Nolan will be helping with questions. In the next 2 weeks, next week, we'll be joined by Seamus Carney, Patrick Forrestal, and Mike Egan. And the following week, Mark Plunkett, Thomas McCarthy, Veronica Naim, and Dominica Kroll. So I suppose a very strong cast of nutrient management expertise across Teagasc. So what I might do is just start a presentation, Noel, and hand over to you as chair.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for setting the scene so well there. And just to reiterate, to welcome everybody here this morning. I won't be much longer, but just to remind you, if you have any questions for Pat or Tim or David, please put them into the Q&A tab that's there. We will we have a questions and answers session right at the end of the 3 presentations, but where we can, we will ask Pat or Tim or David a few questions just after they present. So if you indicate who the question is for as well, that would help us as well. So listen, without further ado, Pat, we'll hand over to you to present, and we'll catch up at the end of this. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my presentation there?
Yeah, we can see your presentation, Pat, yeah.
Okay, so the area I'm just looking at is we've had, I suppose, a really difficult 2 years in relation to fertiliser, acquiring fertiliser, using fertiliser, and there's a lot of changes happened over that 2 years, and there's elements in which we need to redress and move back on, and there's other elements of what's happened over the last couple of years that we need to hold on to. So I'm just trying to address the challenges that you'll be facing in working with farmers this year. The energy crisis had, and I suppose the outline of the talk, I'll be looking at the impact on fertiliser sales, the potential impacts on soil fertility, and we've compiled the 2023 soil analysis results, and I'll give you a quick look at those. We'll look a little bit at a historic context of what happened, I suppose, 10 years previously, or 10 or 11 years previously, when we had a similar crisis in relation to fertiliser prices and fertiliser use, and just to provide some future direction. And just to look at the challenges, I mean, there's three big challenges and a whole series of what you might describe as complementary challenges. But the big three challenges that we have going forward are to maintain and increase grass and crop yield. And over the last couple of years, my colleagues on the technical side are saying that obviously with the reduction in fertiliser use, there has been some reduction in grass yield. And the big challenge is trying to maintain that reduction in particularly nitrogen use while maintaining and potentially increasing crop yield. But we also have environmental challenges to reduce emissions and to reduce losses to water. On top of that, we now have this year the fertiliser register, and in general, an increased regulatory environment with changes that are happening in the Nitrates Action Programme. We have the challenge there. We've achieved a huge level of reduction in nitrogen use. We have got to the targeted level of 300,000 tonnes from 400,000 tonnes. Retaining that reduction will be a major achievement in its own right. But we have to be cognizant of soil fertility, and a huge part of allowing us to reduce nitrogen is having higher soil fertility. And always there, cost is a huge element. So trying to reduce the overall cost to farmers. Just looking at fertiliser use over the decades, and I'm using a slide that Mark Plunkett produced earlier. When we hit a crisis back in 2000, in the early 2000s, 2007-8, and we had the introduction of the nitrates regulation, we saw a substantial and sustained reduction in nitrogen use, and this was mirrored by reductions in the other elements as well. And as we, I suppose, came out of that, fertiliser prices went back down, and we had the abolition of quotas. Fertiliser use went up, and as did nitrogen use went up, as did the other elements. But you can see they track each other. P and K use track very closely to nitrogen, and that's pretty obvious given that we use a lot of compound products. Looking at the last year, we see from the reduction we got in 2022, another huge reduction down to 280,000 tonnes in 2023, with stocks that mightn't be as quite as big a reduction with stock carryover that may have happened. But aligned to that, even though we were trying to address it, we saw significant reductions also in P and K use. In terms of lime usage over the years, in the period from up to about 2012, we were averaging around 700,000 tonnes with a soil fertility campaign to try and improve pH. From 2013 on, we saw that increase to about an average of 1 million tonnes, and more recently over the last 3 years that's gone up to about 1.3 million tonnes. So really good progress there, and really important part of maintaining soil fertility. If we look at P's and K's, again over the years, the reduction in fertiliser, and in looking at this graph, what we're looking at is index 4, 3, 2, and 1, and for high production farms, we're looking at trying to have an objective of having soils in index 3. And we saw from 2007 right through to 2017, we were getting consistent drops in soil fertility. And in effect, this was not consistent with the levels of production that we were trying to improve. From 2017 to 2023, we've seen improvements. But the reality is, with the level of reduction that we've seen in the last couple of years, there's a lag time in that reflecting it's pretty likely that we're going to start to see reductions in soil fertility again as we move forward, unless we change substantially the narrative around the use of P and K. Very similar trends in soil K, dropping to 2017, and then soil fertility improving in that period since. But again, the challenge is going to be there. So what are we trying to do? And this is where it gets really complex. In relation to nitrogen, we're trying to maintain that reduction that we have achieved over the last couple of years. Key part of retaining that is improving nitrogen use efficiency, and a key part of retaining nitrogen use efficiency, or improving nitrogen use efficiency, is having very high soil fertility. So to do that, we need to decouple to improve or to increase the amount of P and K back up to what we would consider to be sustainable levels without a corresponding increase in nitrogen. So the challenges at farm level then are to reverse the fall in P and K use, and in doing that to improve soil fertility, increase and also then requirements to increase protected urea, so by replacing ordinary urea to reduce ammonia emissions, and replacing CAN to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in doing so, we need to maximize the effects of the available nutrients on the farm, and I suppose in particular slurry. And I'll come back to it. One of the things that we, I suppose, haven't been particularly successful over the last number of years is in terms of targeting within the farm. And as I say, I'll come back to that. But if we're to achieve what we need to achieve over the next couple of years, the product mix that's used on most farms needs to change substantially. And in relation to protected urea, if we don't see substantial increases, we've been seeing relatively small incremental increases. If we don't see substantial increases in the near future, I think regulation is likely to step into that space, and I think we'd be better to try and get that to happen in a voluntary way rather than letting regulation handle it. So the change at farm level that we need to see, we've talked about the less nitrogen, but in reality, we're going to require a reduction in the amount of CAN and the amount of CAN compounds, such as, I suppose, the traditionally cut sward and pasture sward. We need to see more protected urea in the mix and more high P and K compounds to do two things. One, to increase the application of P and K, but also to allow us to use protected urea in the mix of fertilizer. And if we do this and do this effectively, we can achieve the various objectives that are there in terms of soil fertility, in terms of production, in terms of environmental outcome, and it can, if we move in this direction, it will give financial benefit because it's a lower cost fertilizer mix for the farmer. But as I said, a substantial change in the mix of product and in the mindset of farmers in relation to what's needed. Just looking again at soil fertility and soil and the distribution of nutrient across the farm. One of the objectives we would have had over the years would be to increase the number and the amount of area in index 3. At the moment, and right throughout the years, it's been stubbornly close to about 25%. And when we would have been, when we're giving farm advice, one of the aims is to, I suppose, the fields that are in index 4 to reduce the application of nutrient into them so that they drop into index 3, and in the case of index 1s and 2s, to use build-up and to target them for organic manures to get them into index 1 and 3. But for the most part, we have completely failed, if you want, to increase the proportion of index 3 soils that are there. And I think a lot of that is down to, I suppose, habit-based fertilizer application, not sufficient targeting at farm level. If we're trying to get the maximum use of the nutrients that we have, there needs to be better targeting, better use of soil results to identify the areas that need nutrient and to identify the areas that potentially don't need nutrient. And cognizant of that, for many farmers, we're not looking for a substantial number at lower levels of production. We're not looking for maybe index 3. For a lot of them, index 2 might be quite sufficient. And for farmers where you're looking at high nature value pastures, etc., maintenance at index 1 is probably the target. So in conclusion, just over the last 2 years, it's been really disruptive in terms of what's happened to the whole fertilizer industry. But moving forward, there's a huge amount of change required at farm level, and farmers are going to require a huge amount of assistance to make those changes. We have a lot of problems facing us if we don't get that change in terms of productivity, even down to the production of, I suppose, more clover-based grass requiring high levels of soil fertility. We will not get that increase of clover in our mix without improvement in soil fertility management. And the other element is regulation is increasing all the time. And again, if there isn't substantial change in some of the outcomes that we're looking for, or towards some of the outcomes that we're looking for, regulation will step in and deal with it. So listen, just a quick, I suppose, statement of the challenges that are facing all of you over the next, I suppose, particularly the next couple of months in working with farmers, in planning fertilizer programs, and in trying to, I suppose, communicate with farmers the importance of some change practice in what they're doing. So thanks very much, Noel.
Thank you very much, Pat, for that interesting start to the conference. And I think it's I suppose we get the sense that history could be repeating itself here on this from what you're highlighting there. And I suppose our job is to try and make sure that we can break that pattern. But I suppose maybe a quick question there for you, Pat, before we go on to the next person there. Nutrient management planning, obviously at the end you highlighted the importance of getting that nutrient distribution right. But I suppose, and while you're indicated at the start of the conference the need to get this out early in the year, but we're also coinciding with a very, very busy time of the year for both farmers and advisors, and getting that nutrient distribution and time to look at a fertilizer plan. Maybe that's not there for farmers and advisors, but notwithstanding that, I think it's still a very worthwhile exercise. And maybe what would you say to try and encourage people to have an extra look at it going forward, particularly for this spring?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of tools. On a lot of farms, there is now soil analysis. It's been a huge increase over the last couple of years. Part of it is regulatory. I suppose part of it is farmers beginning to realize the value of it. But I think that there's a huge importance of not just putting those soil results into a drawer and forgetting about them, identifying clearly where nutrient and extra nutrient is needed, and equally as important, identifying those areas where maybe nutrient levels are high and very little, if any, in those index 4s is needed. And I mean, there's an increased toolkit there. If we look at, and Tim will be talking in the next section about NMP online, but one of the communications tools we have is the mapping section of that, where you very, very quickly you can produce maps to support farmers and indicate where nutrient is needed and where nutrient isn't, and to try and help them to understand what needs to happen on their farm.
Okay, and I suppose just to kind of move on from that, you know, a couple of questions coming in the chat there or in the Q&A about the allowances for phosphorus. Are they sufficient to build up from index 1, index 2 up to the target of index 3? Bearing in mind all the rules and regulations that are there now around different soil types and organic matter and all that kind of thing. And I suppose, is there indications then that where we have poor soil fertility, the science, does that back up that we reduce grass production in the back of that?
Yeah, and I think there's clear signs there that if our soil fertility is wrong, not only is our production affected, our nitrogen use efficiency and the efficiency of use of other elements is impacted. So it's quite clear that a balanced soil fertility is required to achieve high output. Sorry, the first part of that was...
Yeah, it's just, you know, the allowances that are there.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the allowances.
Are they sufficient?
Yeah. The allowances for phosphorus have always been tight, and over the last number of years we've worked and various people have worked with the Department of Agriculture in terms of looking at those allowances and identifying specific issues. I think a number of years ago it was highlighted that to allow build-up, the levels of phosphorus in particular that were allowed would be very slow in achieving that build-up. So the levels that a farmer could use were improved by using the phosphorus build-up rules within the NAP. So I think with those, there is a reasonable prospect for farmers to build up soil fertility. But it is challenging, and it is also very expensive to build up soil fertility. So a combination of building of soil fertility and feeding the crop is required.
Yeah, it's really a long-term plan.
Yeah.
Best facilitated by a nutrient management plan. Pat, thanks very much for that. And in the interest of time, we'll leave it there.
Okay.
So next up, we have Tim Hyde. So Tim, you ready to go? Good morning, Tim. How are you?
Morning, Noel.
So Tim, you're going to talk to us this morning a little bit on the implications of the fertiliser register and maybe how to help advisors put together some fertiliser information for farmers, maybe to help answer that question that I asked Pat a few minutes ago about the time pressure the farmers and advisors are under.
Yeah,
Correct.
so just give me a second, Noel, there, and I'll share my screen.
Okay.
I'm lucky enough to be in the sunny west today, so I'm not too sure if you can see the full screen at this stage.
Yeah, Tim, we're just seeing your slides there now, so we're not seeing the slideshow.
Yeah, for some reason it's not. Hold on now.
Yeah,
And
just switch there. Yeah. Perfect. Tim.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Noel. Look, I've about 20 minutes this morning and everything going well. I might do a bit of a live demo as well, which is always dangerous of NMP online. So in advance of that, I apologize if it doesn't work, but I hope it does. Noel, what I'm going to just turn off my camera here as well, so not to confuse things. But look, where I'm coming from is a follow-on from Pat, and Pat mentioned a good few things. He mentioned about nutrient management planning. He mentioned about nutrient use efficiency. He mentioned about detailed fertiliser planning. And the challenge we have as an advisors or as consultants, as merchants, as farmers is, you know, the National Fertiliser Database, which I have mentioned in this presentation, the NFD, is posing additional challenges because farmers, everybody all the stakeholders are concerned about how much am I allowed by, when can I buy it, etc. So I'm just going to move on here, Noel. I hope the slides move on with me. Just Pat mentioned about soil fertility, and it's hugely important we talk about optimal soil fertility in the right place. And Pat mentioned about higher stock farms and maybe for the lower stock farms where our optimal soil fertility lies. The one challenge with the optimal soil fertility is that it's very complex, and I'm not going to get into the processes of it other than to say that, you know, the Lieberg's law of the minimum here, the soil fertility barrel, really shows to us the complexity around soil fertility, whether it's nutrients that have been going into the system, the interactions of soil processes, in pH, nutrient inputs, and we're always talking about reducing nutrient inputs and increasing our nutrient use efficiency, which this is all affected by the complexity of soil fertility. Pat highlighted about the drop or the concern on the drop of fertiliser P and K usage. We've seen huge improvements in the amount of lime that's been spread over the last number of years, but P and K usage has dropped. And obviously we have to increase our nutrient use efficiency and also improve optimal soil fertility in the right place. And the challenge that we have is about the simple fertiliser plan, which is just giving a farmer a shopping list to go to the co-op to buy X amount of protected urea or 18612 or whatever the right product is, versus the field-to-field advice. So at the moment, there's an awful lot of requests from farmers looking for fertiliser plans, and we call them nutrient management plans. We can call them fertiliser plans. It doesn't really matter. Nutrient management plan takes into account maybe a little bit more complexity around what fertiliser you can buy based on where you spread it, or you know, the complexity of the calculations of the nitrous action plan. But really, there's been a significant increase amongst advisors getting requests from clients, driven by the National Fertiliser Database. There's a proposed cut of 5 to 10% in fertiliser N under the nitrous action plan. I know David's going to mention that a little bit later. And the new rules and regulation that Pat mentioned, if you have tillage land, not samples, your P index 4 straight away allowed no organic or chemical P on that land. Any grassland farms where the previous year's GSR is over 130 is at P4, where there's no soil samples. And P4 is it equals no chemical P and no imported organic P. And with the National Fertiliser Database, what's happening in some situations where farms are importing organic manures from a pig farm, a poultry farm, a cattle farm, is that they're now coming to say, well, look, I know I'm part of the National Fertiliser Database now. What fertiliser can I use? Can I import this organic manures? There's a lot more queries coming in a lot earlier in the year on that. There's been a huge increase in soil sampling. And Pat, I think, mentioned to me earlier that there was maybe a 200% increase in Teagasc samples in the last couple of years. And the big question that farmers are asking is, what can I buy? How much I can buy? They're even asking, when can I buy it? Because they're all concerned about the National Fertiliser Database. And the National Fertiliser Database, obviously, there's closing stocks as declared on the 15th of September last year. Any fertiliser that was bought since that date, the end of the year 23, and fertiliser bought in so far. And to give you a little bit of put this in context, if you're of a lowly stocked farm, grassland farm with no soil sample, you're talking about one bag of 18612 per acre before you reach your chemical P limit, not your nitrogen limit. And P is really the restricting factor on a lot of those lower stocked farms. So a small bit of an emoji there maybe to say, look, it's complex, it's not simple. And a lot of the questions coming in from farmers or from merchants selling fertiliser or fertiliser reps on the road is, what is the limit? How do we get those fertiliser shopping list out to a farmer? In reality, the National Fertiliser Database is that there's an awful lot of people trying to encourage farmers to put the right product on the right place, at the right rate, at the right time. And do farmers know their fertiliser limits for their farm? Farmers are asking, I said, what is my limit? Increase in soil sampling by 50%, that should say 200%, apologies. And there's a notable increase in fertiliser plans through the NMP system, through whatever system is out there that is available to farmers and advisors using it. And the big question is, am I compliant? Am I going to be under my limit? And the worry that I have is that the compliance part of it will put the fertiliser usage down again. And that there'll be a safety zone here where we'll say, well, I won't buy as much as I'm really allowed because I don't want to go over the limits now that everything is recorded in the system. And what that will that have an effect on will the National Fertiliser Database or all the compliance issues that are out there reduce soil fertility long term? And Pat has said we've come through a difficult period in relation to the cost of fertiliser being so very high a couple of years ago. Is there a natural decline there in fertiliser usage, or is it the wrong type of fertiliser being used? So what I'm trying to say is here, we need to keep very much an eye on it. NMP Online, I'm going to give it a quick plug. It's probably the widest used software across agri-professionals for doing fertiliser planning. We have 250 agencies across Teagasc, private consultants, ACA, fertiliser companies, co-ops, etc. Even people just doing fertiliser planning for grassland and tillage farms. And in those 250 agencies, there's about 700 different people using NMP Online. And we also give it as a facility to students as well. When doing a fertiliser plan is where I'm going to get into the next few minutes. There's a certain amount of background information you need to produce the limits for the farm. What's the max amount of fertiliser and the type of fertiliser that they can buy, or if they're importing organic manures, how does that come into the mix? Previous year's grassland stocking rate, the total nitrogen produced by the cattle the previous year, concentrates fed to cattle the previous year, land area in the year we're in, soil results are available. And what I'm going to show you is doing a simple fertiliser plan. We can do it quite quickly to give a limit to a farmer. And it takes, if you have the right information, as I've said here, you're talking about less than 10 minutes. This is a grassland fertiliser plan. You also need to know where the organic manures will be spread. And very important, if you have high organic matter soils or areas on the farm, and there's a layer on NMP Online, a mapping layer to show you that, you need to take that into account as well. The simple grassland plan, they're positive. It's quick. You can get a total NMP for the farm, fertiliser, shopping list. It's simple to use. Obviously, we should be advising products that will reduce emissions, and farmers know their limits. So it's meeting all the requirements from a time perspective in an already busy sector for advisors and agri-agents at this time of year. The negatives is, Pat mentioned about field-to-field advice. The simple grassland nutrient management plan won't do that. It doesn't give you a liming plan, takes no account of soil type if you really want to go down, if you want to do a very simple one very quickly. It may impact individual field soil fertility status because you're doing an overall accounting mechanism. And if you're a tillage farm, well, then it's a bit more complex. And the challenge we have here is, yes, it'll give us the thumbs up for giving the fertiliser shopping list to the farmer or the co-op, but there are negatives around it as well. So a bit of a caution around its usage. So Noel, if it's okay, I'm going to do a bit of a fertilizer. I'm going to just stop sharing here for a minute. I hope this works. Noel, are there any questions in there while I'm getting this set up in the background?
Yeah, Tim, look, that's all very good there, I suppose. But yeah, you mentioned about the simple fertilizer plan there and the background information that's needed. How easy is it to get that now? I know you said 10 minutes, but is it 10 minutes to put the data in, or how long will it take to get the background information in first, I suppose?
Depending on what you have access to. If you're an agri-agent, you would have access to quite a lot of that information in ag food.
Yeah.
And it's just, you need to have that conversation with the farmer as well. You know, you need to get the concentrates usage and all that.
Yeah.
So Noel, I don't know if you can see my screen here, Noel. I'm conscious that I don't want to go over time, but I'm going to try and...
You're not sharing as far as I can.
Yeah, I'm going to do that now in 2 seconds, and hopefully it'll all work for us. Just let us know when you can see that,
Perfect.
Noel.
Tim, yeah, you're on there now.
Okay, so look, this is the NMP Online. As I said, I'm going to try and run through it reasonably quickly. And look, within the system, I'm going to say, look, this is the client, a simple NMP I'm going to start with. Create the plan. And so a lot of people, I see a lot of users on the call here, Noel, who may not be NMP users. So this is just to show them roughly what the system can do. Like every new software system, it's only as good as the information you put in. So I'm putting in some basic information here in the background to set up the plan. Apologies, I'm going to work in units per acre and bags per acre because the majority of farmers that we're dealing with understand these things. So I'll just start the plan there. I'm just going to put in, this is just a background page. So this just works out the nitrate stocking rate calculations. And what I've done is I'm going to import fertilizer, kind of an Excel sheet here that's going to bring in going well, 4 type of P index 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. So samples, we've all put them down as loam just for the moment, and the P values here are based on the indices that are in the nitrates directive. So I'm just going to go P1 plot. I'm just going to say this is a 40-hectare farm, Noel, for easiness sake. I'm putting it all down as grazing for the moment, because within the nitrates directive, and we talk about complexities of the nitrates action plan, it doesn't matter whether a crop is grazing or silage. They say they get the same allowances. So I'm just putting it all down here as grazing. And what I forgot to do for the first few is I forgot to allocate the soil sample to it. So I'll just go back for a second. And what we're finding, Noel, is that, you know, a detailed fertilizer plan does take a little bit of time. And as I said, the challenge for advisors is balancing that time between what they need to actually to give a detailed fertilizer plan versus just producing the fertilizer list. So look, I'm just going to put in the stock numbers here for a minute as well. This is sorry, no, that's the wrong one. This is a dry stock farm, because, you know, most of the derogation farms will have some type of nutrient management plan as part of the derogation requirement. And what I'm doing here is that this is the NMP system, then asks us where the animals are being housed, how many is there for the winter, what the average number over the year is, are they on slurry, are they on outwintered, or are they on FYM? And I'm just going to put down, we have some ewes here as well. And in this situation, we're going to say that the ewes are all outwintered. They might be in for a short period, sorry. And I don't know how many minutes we're at this, Noel, now, but as I say, if you have all the information, you can start getting to having a nutrient management plan nearly ready to give to a farmer. And like, it's easy enough for me to do this because I do it on a regular basis. But, you know, I'm just going to call this name nuts. And a lot of this information you can get quite easily from the farmer. Like, I've only put in 3 or 4 different bits of information so far. So at this stage, then we come down to where we put on the slurry. It says we're producing 294 cubic meters of slurry based on the county and the area that I'm in. So you can see this is P index 1 and 2 here. I'm going to say, obviously, we would assess, first of all, can these lands take it? And look, I've put on a little bit more than what's there, but look, we'll just say that this is only for indicative purposes. And you can see up here, I've got a maximum chemical NNP allowed based on all the figures that we've been asked for. The previous year's GSR, we looked at the stock numbers. We have a certain amount of land at P index 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can see the indexes are here. And then I can come and give my fertilizer shopping list to my farmer. Now I can start with protected urea if I want. And look, I have a lot of this worked out for the purposes of today. So look, it would take you a little bit longer maybe until you get used to the system. And, you know, I'm up here, that's the amount of nitrogen I put on so far. You can see as we recommend the fertilizer, again, this is on a block basis, depending on soil samples. Obviously, if you had no soil samples, the system can also take that into account, and you can just allocate all the land into one block of grazing, or if you had a bit of tillage, it'll do it very quickly as well. And the benefits of having using a nutrient management system like this is that it's there for you to view. It's there for you to print off reports, and, you know, it's all stored there for you. Now, Noel, I've done that very quickly there, and just to show it to people, look, you know, there's a bit of a shopping list. The recommended figure here is what we use is from the Teagasc Green Book, and obviously that's under review every couple of years. The maximum allowed is what they're allowed under the nitrates directive, and this is what I've recommended them to use. Now, obviously, I have a bit of leeway here. I can push this up a little bit if I want. If I want to go to, you know, if I want to push this up nearer the limit, I can do so. So no, I'm just going to stop sharing there, because that's just to show you very quickly. I don't know how many minutes we were at that, but we can produce a fertilizer plan here for a farmer with soil samples by bulking all the soil samples into P index 1, 2, 3, and 4s. Obviously, if there was organic matter, we take that into account as well along the way. But as I said, Noel, I'm just going to stop sharing here and turn on my video, because that really is the end of my presentation, other than to say we have a lot of challenges there in relation to giving detailed fertiliser plans to farmers, to co-ops, to agri-merchants. And Pat mentioned about soil fertility. The challenge that I see is that where do we get the fine line between producing something that's compliant, something that delivers on maintaining, if not increasing, our optimal soil fertility, and not spreading too little or not spreading too much. Getting the background information is key, as you've already said. Giving the farmer the fertilizer allowances for the year, or the products and how much they can buy. But what the big challenge with me is, when you do have this fertilizer plan, you give it to the farmer, then they'll say, well, I want a little bit more of a detailed fertilizer plan on a field by field. So that there is a challenge there in relation to time wise. So look, I hope I haven't run too much over time, Noel. I apologize. I'm sure there might be a few questions in there, so I'll take them now, if that's okay.
No, you're fine, Tim, and you didn't you didn't go over time. But like, I think what you posed the question there at the very start around fear of being compliant could drive down soil fertility, the unintended consequence. And what you've shown there, I think, is that there is a way of getting, as you pointed out, at least get a shopping list that the farmer will know where he or she stands with regards to it. It's not ideal; it doesn't cover the field by field basis, but from the point of view of a starting point, where you have a farmer that is ready to go and get some fertilizer out of the co-op and wants to know what to get, at least you can give the person some direction. And I suppose you'd be advising to go to the silage fields, or the fields that look poorest, or whatever on the back of that. So I think that makes sense, Tim. But I suppose ultimately, if we want to really redress or really address fertility problems, the full nutrient management plan is the way to go.
100%, Noel. And what we're finding is that people who are kind of starting to use to get the basic plan first, give the farmer the shopping list, and then come back and maybe divide up your fertilizer plan into field by field basis is obviously optimal way, the best way to do it if you can. Just on that note, within that simple fertilizer plan, we do have lands built into P index, grassland lands built into P index 1, 2s, 3s, and 4s. So you can see on the 4s, we didn't put out any organic manures. We didn't put out any organic manures on the 3s. We looked at the index 1 and 2s. Yes, they're suitable from a water quality perspective, from a slope perspective, from a soil type to get out your organic manures. So you're starting to get down to, even though it's not specifically field by field or every plot by every plot, we are bulking them together and say, look, those index 1s and 2s need 18-6-12 plus a bit of organic manures, and you're using protected urea with a little bit of sulfur in it on all the lands, just at different rates depending on what the index they're at.
And I suppose, Tim, just in interest of time, we have a question here about where they have no P allowance, but they have the index 2 soils. And the question is, how do they build up the P index in that? So I think you kind of answered it there in your previous one, but maybe just to direct the answer on.
What we're seeing, especially, and Pat mentioned NMP Online, the mapping function that you can that goes with it, that shows the different fields at different P indices in a color format that's quite easily read, and farmers like it. Yeah. It's your distribution of organic manures that you have in the holding. You need to target your organic manures onto those lower P indices ground, even though your overall farm allowance. And that's a very good question from that person, because that person understands, I have indexed 1 or 2 soils, P index 1 or 2 soils, but I have a 0 P allowance because of the nuance of the calculations in relation to using a lot of concentrate on the farm. The concentrate is taken into account in your overall farm balance. And that's something that over the years, it's been hard to maybe get across to some people looking at soil fertility or soil results, is that your soil result may show P index 1 or 2 lands, but when you do the overall calculation, which I've mentioned, you may not be allowed any P allowance because of the nitrates directive, the way the calculations are done. So obviously your distribution of organic manures is very important. Maybe the use of slurry, FYM, soiled water, if you have it, try and get it out there. And I'm sure it's going to be covered in other parts of the series, but actually analysing your slurry to see what's in it. is very important.
Okay.
I understand. I see the question here. How am I supposed to build indexes? There is, for higher stock farmers, you could maybe look at what's called P build-up as part of the nitrates directive, and I'd ask your consultant about that. That may give you a little bit of a
Leeway.
leeway in relation to your P allowance.
Okay, and look at the you can see the questions there, but there's a suggestion that maybe you do a short video, Tim, on how on that demo that you gave a minute ago, and then obviously a query around the timing, the pressure the advisors are going to be under, and it's we're well aware that this time of the year is just it's a really bad time of year to be talking about trying to get the fertilizer, because everybody's so busy and advisors are so busy and farmers are so busy as well. So it's just but it's not going to change, unfortunately.
That's that question, Noel, on the video. I have it done.
You have it done.
I'm just going to take me a day or two to get to edit it and put it just up on the public website of Teagasc, or maybe as part of the conference presentations, we'll put along with that.
Yeah,
okay.
Put along with that. Listen, thanks, Tim, for that.
Yeah, apologies for being a bit over time, Noel.
You're grand. So look, we'll keep moving along. So just remind people the Q&A is there. So keep the questions coming in. So soil. So next on, we're on to David Wall now. So David, you're ready to go there. You're going to look at soil fertility, more important than ever is your title. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Noel. Good morning, everybody. So as Noel has said, I'll just start to share my screen, and you might give me a nod, Noel, when you can see that.
Yeah, you're good to go there, David. Yeah,
okay.
Perfect.
So as I said, good morning, everybody. I'm going to deal with, I suppose, soil fertility issues, the policy piece around that's linked with soil fertility, I suppose, in terms of the environment, and also, I suppose, some metrics around soil fertility and specifically nitrogen. So nitrogen gets a lot of attention itself, and phosphorus from a regulatory standpoint, and the reason being is that out of all the nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus are the two reactive nutrients. So once they get into either our atmosphere or into the aquatic environment, we end up with some problems. So that does focus the attention, and I suppose it focuses our need to manage them that little bit better. So the importance of soil and soil fertility, it's paramount, I would say, in terms of production systems. The success of your farm or your business in terms of your pursuit of agriculture will depend on how well you're able to manage your soils. Soils are different around the country. We're given what we're given in that respect, but how we manage them can have a big effect on the ultimate output that we get from the soils. And ultimately, as we move through, we're in different parts of the country with different weather. So that's a factor there. And both the soil and that weather are the primary factor in terms of what you can use that soil for, how much grass you'll grow, crops, etc. on that soil. But management is a key part of that, and fertility as the fuel for that growth is critical there. And then as we move on, you utilize that feed or fodder in terms of a grassland for dry stock or for dairy. You sell an output, and ultimately we make some money. And I suppose for every farm, that's a conundrum, and it has been a conundrum as Pat has outlined for the last couple of years or couple of seasons in particular. Fertilizer prices have been high. The price cost squeeze in terms of farmers questioning, the return on investment in terms of nutrient inputs, and most farmers have responded with that by keeping their nitrogen to some degree in the mix, or at least at a reduced rate. But many have chosen to take a P or K holiday. They haven't seen that they with high fertilizer prices that they could get a return on that short-term investment in P and K. And ultimately, it's not a short-term investment. That's your long-term investment. It's akin to the engine oil in the system. And we can buy the fuel, but if we don't put in the engine oil, eventually the system will seize. And I suppose that's what Pat has outlined there in terms of the first presentation. You know, what are our legacy effect going to be of not putting in the other inputs, the pH, the lime part, the P and the K. And, you know, that will manifest in the next couple of years as those soil samples start coming in. And that kind of limits our potential there to meet the objectives, policy or otherwise, in terms of reducing nitrogen in the system. And I suppose, you know, sustainable management is going to be reliant on the long-term productivity of our soils as a primary objective for every farm. So the challenges, without labouring the point, you're all very aware of the challenges. It's in the media, it's coming from the legislators on a daily basis. However, it is important, I suppose, that we don't stick our head in the sand, I suppose, and ignore these challenges, because they're not going to go away. And I suppose for farmers, for you as advisors or agronomists, maintaining or increasing agricultural outputs or production levels is a primary objective of the industry, of farmers, etc. However, we do need to do that in the context of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving water quality, and protecting biodiversity, which will be the next part that will come to the fore. And these are critically important. In that is nitrogen alone, in terms of reducing losses from agriculture to the environment. Obviously, phosphorus is in there as well from a water quality standpoint. And the aim here is to improve nitrogen use efficiency. So what's that in its own right? For every input of nitrogen, we want to get more return on that input, and ultimately to limit the surplus of nitrogen that remains in the soil when the production is done. Because that has a higher risk, I suppose, of loss to the environment if there's a large surplus in the system. It can't be turned into organic matter if there's too much there. And ultimately, both rainfall or denitrifying bacteria will consume that surplus nitrogen, and it will be a loss from the farm. Number one, a loss to your bottom line on your investment, and end up in the environment where it can have a deleterious effect. Critically, when you put all this together, it's important to retain we're talking about pasture grassland farms here today, but also tillage farming systems. We need to retain these. They are the bedrock, I suppose, of our economy. And they're predominantly family farms, and they do achieve the highest environmental standards of production systems around the world. So we should be very proud of our systems, but that's not to say that we should sit on our laurels and not get stuck into these systems to move forward, increase efficiency, and do better, or strive to do better. So what are the policy signals in that respect? And the policy signals, if I was to put it into a sentence or a question, is how do we farm with less reliance on chemical nitrogen in future? So that ultimately is the future. You know, we're going to be farming, hopefully productively, sustainably, profitably, but we'll be doing it with somewhat less nitrogen than we might have used in the past. So the signals, the EU Farm to Fork has indicated a 20% reduction in fertiliser use, and they specifically mentioned water quality in the next sentence with that. Under our nitrates action programme, we've had a 10% reduction. You're all aware of that in the last year. However, there's provision there in the NAP to reduce fertiliser in use by a further 5%, depending on water quality trends. And that is currently in the mix. As you're all aware, we've been through another mini review in the last 12 months. It's my understanding that there'll be a public consultation, and it's quite likely that 5% will come up for scrutiny and maybe invoked or maybe enforced within the near future. So we must prepare for that as you as advisors or agronomists in terms of that planning part. And soil fertility is going to be key as we throttle back on that nitrogen to make sure we increase the efficiency. Other things then, if we look a little bit longer, not too far, 2025 is coming fast. The Food Vision group is looking at a 22 to 25% reduction by 2025. And ultimately, Acclimatise is looking for a reduction to 300 to 325,000 tonnes of nitrogen nationally under the Climate Action Plan, and talks of a 20% reduction by 2030 there as well. So again, all those signals are looking at reduced nitrogen, and I suppose for us here today in terms of the Soil Fertility Conference, where does soil fertility come in terms of allowing that transition on farms to lower chemical nitrogen without a detrimental effect on production levels, etc. Just for nitrates directive in terms of the current allowances, you can see there the highest level of allowances have fallen to 225 from the 250. That middle one, 170 to 210 type allowance is down from 283 to 254, and also there have been cuts at the lower level. If we think about a 5% cut then, what would that look like? Those levels, especially at the upper level, because it is being talked about for farms over 170, those would fall from 225 down to around 213, or that 170 to 210 band would fall to 241 with a 5% cut. So significant reductions. Obviously, farmers are going to need to know how to compensate for these losses in the nitrogen that they're used to using on an annual basis. And things like the better use of slurry, things like clover and other technologies there are going to be critical in making up that deficit and making sure the production systems move forward. Just switching gears for a minute in terms of a little bit of a comparison of where we sit in terms of our nitrogen use and our nitrogen metrics or sustainability indicators, as they might be known as, compared firstly with our European counterparts, and then I'll also look at the different farming sectors. So what is a nitrogen balance first and foremost? So it's the inputs minus the outputs over the total area. So essentially what you get is the nitrogen kilograms per hectare in terms of the balance, and usually that's a surplus. You'd hope that it'd be a smaller surplus because it's left over from production. However, as you can see here, the countries on the left-hand side here have a very high surplus, 200 kilograms plus in some cases, and I'm showing here in terms of the periods 2000 to 2003, and then a more recent period, 2012 to 2015, which is available on the EU website. If we look here in Ireland in the red, we have back in 2000 to 2003, we had a 68.8 kilogram surplus per hectare across all our farms. Obviously, more intensive farms will have a higher surplus. More extensive farms that are using very little nitrogen or have very little imports of nitrogen in different forms, concentrate feeds, etc., will have a much lower surplus. But on average, on a national basis, back in 2000 to 2003 period, we're about 68.8 kilograms per hectare on a national basis. That reduced significantly there down to 2012 to 2015, down to 38.8 kilograms. It's grown somewhat in the past period, and we would be sitting at the moment at somewhere around 50 kilograms per hectare on a national basis. So low in comparison, however, it does indicate that we have a little bit more work to do. If we delve more deeply into the nitrogen balances and we look here on an enterprise basis, dairy, cattle, sheep, tillage, and the average then in black for all farms. And we look over the period 2015 right up to very recently, the 2020 to 2022 period. If we think about all farms there, all farms through the NFS database, we were back in 2015 to 2017 our period, we're about 71 kilograms, and we're still sitting around 20 in 2020 to 2022, about 71 kilograms. If we look at the other systems, by and large, I would say the trend is relatively flat. However, for dairy, there had been an increase in that nitrogen balance or nitrogen surplus upwards from around 160. It increased to around 180 there in the 2017 to 2019 period. Some of that, I suppose, extra use there in terms of chasing fodder during drought years and other years, but we've learned a lot since then, I would say, and that nitrogen balance is beginning to fall in the last two periods, which is very positive. But overall, dairy would have the highest balance. Cattle there sitting around 55 kilograms at the moment. Sheep a little bit lower at 44 kilograms, and tillage being the lowest at 33 kilograms per hectare there in terms of tillage. In terms of these balances, what I will say is the higher the balance or the higher the surplus, the higher the potential risk for nitrogen loss. Obviously, with the grassland systems, there is a crop there growing during the winter. So there is some potential there to mop up that nitrogen once we finish spreading fertiliser in the back end on the 15th of September being the last day we can spread fertiliser. Obviously, slurry can go out till the 1st of October, but there is some growth there in terms of that grass crop to mop up that nitrogen. And that's essential that we don't go into the winter with too big of a surplus. For tillage farms, if they're not growing a cover crop, while the nutrient balance or the nutrient surplus might appear low, if there's nothing there to mop it up in the back end, then there's a higher risk for more of that nitrogen to be lost, I suppose, in those free draining soils. So that is critical, I suppose, that we don't go into the winter with a big surplus in the soil, and that we have something green there to mop it up that's actively growing before rainfall and recharge begins to happen. Just one more slide on that. In terms of controlling the nitrogen surplus, will help to minimize nitrate leaching. And as I said, the higher the surplus above grass production levels or total grass demand, then it means that proportionally more of that nitrogen can be lost to leaching. And as we can see here, in a normal range on a farm, if we think about what we would have had under nitrates, we would have had 250 kilograms maximum of nitrogen fertiliser and a stocking rate of up to 250 kilograms in the past. And you can see there that would equate to about 500. And as we increase, we get a little bit more leaching potential losses here modelled as we approach that. If we begin to go above that, because the grass can only take up somewhere in the region of 450, 500 kilograms in terms of a high yield, then proportionally more of that goes to surplus. And you can see here the slope of this line begins to increase rapidly once we get above that. And this goes back to distribution on a farm. So in terms of where the slurry is going, where the stock are, where the fertiliser is going in, that we try to keep that the nutrients distributed over the whole farm. The slurry gets exported to the silage block, away from the grazing block, where it's more needed, and we get an even distribution, especially if we have low index soils. But it is important to understand that surplus and managing that surplus. So getting to that, how do we use some metrics then to understand how efficient we are in terms of nitrogen, and also how to manage maybe that surplus and minimize that? So a couple of definitions here to start off with. Nitrogen use efficiency, what is it? It's a way of understanding the relationship of total nitrogen input compared with output. That's probably the most straightforward definition. So how does our inputs related to what we take out and what we utilize? Nitrogen use efficiency can be described from the crop yield per unit as the total available nitrogen. So if you think about a crop yield, how much of that nitrogen that you put in is recovered by the crop, or the kgs of in uptake from the kgs of in input. And there's a number of sources of available nitrogen on the farm. So we have our applied fertiliser nitrogen and manure nitrogen that we manage. That would be the managed nitrogen that we'd call that. We have nitrogen supplied from mineralisation from soil organic matter, and that can be quite large on some soil types. So that's a key source. We have biological fixed nitrogen supply facilitated by legumes. So if we take white and red clover, if you take in on the tillage side, that could be a pea or a bean crop. We have deposited nitrogen from the atmosphere. So if we think about ammonia losses, they can be redeposited on land, or nitrogen coming down in rainfall. And then we have imported nitrogen in concentrate feed that's directly deposited by the grazing animals or deposited in the slurry tank. And I suppose you have slurry imports then if you want to complete the full list. But there's a lot of sources of nitrogen coming into the farm. So if we think about nitrogen use efficiency, what's the most efficient nitrogen that we use in terms of that nitrogen that we have on the farm? The first part here is the yield, I suppose, or the nitrogen uptake that we produce from the soil N contribution. And if we think about this point here in terms of grass yield, this is nitrogen that we have for free on the farm. Obviously, if you lime your farm and you have a better pH, you can get more of this free nitrogen at the optimum pH. But on the average grassland farm, we can grow between 4 and 6 tons of grass from soil nitrogen over the year. So, you know, that's a good starting point. We have, we'll say on average, 5 tons of grass produced from soil nitrogen. And, you know, the previous depositions that would have happened during the previous grazing season will contribute to that organic matter. And that's a good start before we start to apply fertiliser. The next part of the fertiliser, or the first piece of the fertiliser, is on the most responsive part of the curve. So that's the most efficient nitrogen. You get more uptake from each kilogram that you put on in that region. And, you know, nitrogen use efficiency of that nitrogen is relatively high. The next part is where, I suppose, our response to nitrogen begins to fall. So this could be in the spring when soils are cold and wet, when the day length or the daylight is low in the sky and the grass is not actively growing. You mightn't get as much efficiency there, or you mightn't get much efficiency if we go to the top end and we have oversupplied nitrogen. So this is, I suppose, a critical point, that we don't start to put on too much nitrogen more than the crop needs or the grassland needs. And then there's this nitrogen at the very top end of the response curve that we're not getting any return on investment with that nitrogen, and that leads to nitrogen surplus. So it's not efficient nitrogen. Every kilo that you put on, proportionally more of it is going into surplus because it's not needed, and that's what we want to avoid in the system. Just very briefly, in terms of soil nitrogen supply, what's available from mineralisation? This is a study that we conducted probably about 6 or 7 years ago now, looking across different key soil types in key locations across Teagasc farms and more besides. And you can see there in terms of mineralized soil nitrogen, kilograms per hectare per year. So this is annual basis. We go from some of these soils that might have been ploughed and tilled in the past, lighter soils. Maybe Camellia is not a lighter soil. It might be more limited, I suppose, with waterlogging, etc. That's going to reduce the amount of mineralization, akin to what happens in a peat bog, because air can't get in and those mineralizing bacteria can't work under anaerobic conditions. This is a very light soil. Obviously, Oak Park is a very light soil, and you're somewhere between 80 and 110 kilograms there. If we start to go up into permanent grassland soils, and you can see there that rises there, 140, 130, 140. And then we have some of these soils that are higher in organic matter, but they're good. They are drained soils. Grange, Johnstown Castle, you could be upwards of 200 kilograms per hectare per year in terms of soil nitrogen supply. On average, on managed grasslands, we get about 140 kilograms per hectare per year is what we've measured. So again, that's going to grow you, if we think about 140 kilograms of nitrogen, if we got full 100% nitrogen use efficiency from that, we can grow about 6 or 7 tons. Obviously, we're not going to get 100% use efficiency. So that's where those 5 or 6 tons comes from in terms of production from soil nitrogen. And it is significant. And if we had a target yield on a farm for a stocking rate or whatever else, we may not put the same amount of nitrogen on these soils as we would put on these soils to achieve that target yield. Obviously, on these soils, we would need a lot less. On these soils, if they could achieve that target yield, we'd need more nitrogen. So it is critical to look at this and think about this for our different soil types. Then, once we know in terms of what's available in terms of the soil N, and that's here, these dotted lines here at the bottom, that's our soil N profile. We want to top up in terms of fertiliser and slurry inputs in terms of what we need. So in terms of looking at this graph, this gap between the dotted lines and the solid line here at the top in terms of grass nitrogen demand every week has to be supplied with fertiliser, slurry, nitrogen, etc. If I move this forward again and we think about the average weekly grass nitrogen uptake demand, so this is the nitrogen uptake for a full week, not the nitrogen fertiliser input now, it's the total nitrogen uptake for the week based on this. You can see here at the very start of the year, that's very, very low. In January and even in the first early days of February when the grass is not grown, it could be less than 1 kilo for the whole week in terms of demand. Once we get out here into March, that grows out to around Paddy's Day. We begin to grow, and the demand there is about 4 kilograms of nitrogen uptake, actual uptake per week. Again, these are not what you'd apply in terms of fertiliser. That begins to grow quite rapidly when you go into that rapid growth phase in April into May, up to 9 kilograms per week. So over a month, that'd be about 36 kilograms of total uptake, and then begins to wane and fall as grass grows, as grass growth begins to fall in the back end of the year until we get to the 15th of September when we can't apply any more fertiliser. And obviously on the 1st of October, or the middle of October, depending on the last couple of years, is that slurry date begins to come back to the 1st of October. We won't be applying any more slurry in. So again, it's important to understand, I suppose, what the demand is, what the soil can do. So here, as peak growth comes in here in the middle of the year, also too does peak soil end mineralization. Obviously, as the soils begin to get dry in the summer, then mineralization begins to fall. In the back end, mineralization begins to improve again as the soil has been radiated and warmed up over the year, and ultimately begins to rain, etc., as we move forward. So last few pieces in terms of a few examples in terms of fertiliser recovery efficiency. So nitrogen use efficiency being the total. If we concentrate totally or focus our mind on the recovery of the nitrogen that we put on as fertiliser or slurry from that matter, it's the nitrogen offtake without fertiliser. So that nitrogen that's uptaken from soil reserves minus the nitrogen offtake without the fertiliser over the total fertiliser input, right? So it's what we've basically grown with the additional fertiliser, the additional growth, the additional uptake with fertiliser minus what we've grown from the soil over the total fertiliser input. We'll go through the example. So nitrogen input, so say we're putting on 3,000 gallons of cotton slurry, about 34 kilograms going in from that. A further piece coming from fertiliser input for this first cut silage, another 90 kilograms. So the two of those, about 124 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for that first cut crop. 5 to 6 tons we're expecting to grow here. Nitrogen output, grass production over the 6 weeks growth without fertiliser. So we're going to grow about a ton, 1.2 tons at 2.8% nitrogen equals 34 kilograms to grow that 1.2 tons. And grass production over 6 weeks from the fertiliser, there's going to be an additional 4.5 tons grown with the fertiliser on top of the 1.2 tons to give us about 5.75 tons of total silage, dry matter production from silage. So again, another 135 there. So if we think about the total fertiliser nitrogen uptake just from the fertiliser, it's one minus the other, it's 101 kilograms from the fertiliser. And then if we do the calculation in terms of fertiliser recovery efficiency, 101 divided by the total input, 124, it's 81%. So very efficient in terms of grass silage production. We've put on the fertiliser. We're in a period of peak growth, and we've recovered 81% of the nitrogen in this example. If we think about a grazed pasture, 2.3 cows to the hectare, nitrogen input, soil nitrogen supply before any nitrogen applications. Because we're not taking off the crop, we're taking off milk and meat, we need to account for the soil nitrogen supply directly here. And I've used the average figure, 139 kilograms per hectare on that intensively managed pasture. Organic manure, so we might have put on slurry there in the early part of the year, 34 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen input in that, 3,000 gallons equivalent. Fertiliser nitrogen applications, 191. So basically with the slurry and the fertiliser, I've used 125 kilograms. So that would be our maximum allowance. However, when we add back in the soil nitrogen supply, we've put in, or there is 364 kilograms of available nitrogen in the system. Output, milk yield, 15,000 litres per hectare at 3.7% protein. That's about 6%, 0.6% nitrogen. Nitrogen offtake and live weight gain. The live weight gain, if you think about 2 calves and a little bit, or 2.3 calves, each cow is going to have a calf, plus a little bit of body condition score at 2.1% nitrogen per kilo in that. We do the sums on the milk yield by the nitrogen percentage and the live weight by the nitrogen percentage, and we're taking off 93 kilograms of nitrogen in total in milk and live weight. So we do the sums here. The nitrogen output over the nitrogen input, 93 over 364, and we get 26% nitrogen use efficiency in the graze system, which would be fairly typical in terms of a graze system. Now, I'm going to go one step further. We're looking for an NUE of at least 30. Our target probably would be 35% to increase the NUE to 35%. If we discount the soil end supply, right, and we do a managed nitrogen use efficiency, obviously we're not managing that soil nitrogen supply. If we don't count it, we get a distorted figure. So again, taking out that 139, we're down to 225, we're down to our fertiliser allowance over the same nitrogen output. And you can see here, we end up with a 41% nitrogen use efficiency if we're not counting the soil nitrogen supply. And the same thing would be if you don't count clover. So if there was clover in this sward, you didn't cut back up here on the chemical nitrogen allowance, our nitrogen use efficiency is going to be incredibly low overall if you don't count the clover in the system up here. So very important in terms of that metric. Solutions to improve nitrogen use efficiency. Going to spend a couple of minutes on these before I finish. So the need to increase practice adoption rates on farms is going to be critical as policy and other signals transition us to lower chemical nitrogen use on farms. If farmers are sitting on their hands and all of a sudden the rug is pulled from under them because we get a cut in chemical fertiliser, then you're in a bit of a bind because it's chicken and egg. You haven't set up the system to work with lower nitrogen input. Hence, your fertiliser use efficiency might be still low. And there's very little capacity then to recover or to compensate for that loss, direct loss in fertiliser input. So soil fertility is key here. I would say that's the starting point. Lyman as a part of that, using low emission slurry spreading. Obviously, you get more from your slurry with low emission slurry spreading, so it allows you to throttle back. Protected urea obviously helps you keep more of that nitrogen in the soil, and there's more evidence as we look at the longer term trials, and Patrick Forrestal will talk about this in the next part of the series. And also in terms of clover, the ability to fix nitrogen. And if we have good clover there, 150 kilograms per hectare per year can be achieved there in terms of an input with a huge cost saving. And Mike Egan will talk about that in the next session of this series. Just a couple of things from the research, from what we found. Soil fertility, it's a key driver of nitrogen use efficiency. And if we're operating at an index 1 or 2, I've taken phosphorus as the index here. It could be potassium index, etc. Looking across all the studies, all the measurements that we've done, if we take target index 3 as relative efficiency here, where you're going to maximize your efficiency at 100% relative here, relative to that, operating at an index 1 especially, but even an index 2, we're going to take a hit there that fertilizer use efficiency is going to fall by about 15%. So for each 100 kilograms of fertilizer you put in, you're only getting 85% of that. So 85 kilograms efficiency. So that's a 15% waste straight up by operating at a lower soil index. So that's fairly stark to start off with. Taking this a step further and bringing it out on farm, this is a study that a PhD student, Philip Murphy, conducted fairly recent across 21 intensive grassland farms. 446 fields were looked at over 2 years. And we looked at the nitrogen use efficiency in those fields, on those grass swards, across different levels of soil fertility. So when we looked, and this is uptake efficiency now in the grass, right? It's not in efficiency based on meat and milk. It's direct uptake efficiency into the grass. So if we look at where everything is low, this red bar here, low pH, low P and K, we were getting about 35% nitrogen use efficiency. So essentially, even uptake into the grass about 65% of the nitrogen that was going out on those paddocks wasn't actually making it into the grass at all as a dead loss. If we optimize soil pH without asking the farmer to cut rates or to do anything different, again, we jump there straight away up to about 53% nitrogen use efficiency into the grass, and we reduce that exposure for loss to about 47%. As we begin to climb in terms of P and K, we begin to climb a little bit more. The efficiency is going up here. And ultimately, on these farms where we optimize pH, P or K, we didn't ask the farmer to do anything else to cut his rate, to optimize his rate, his timing, his or her timing, or do anything else. Just by doing that, we're able to optimize the nitrogen use efficiency up to about 63%. So that's fairly stark. Just by getting the soil fertility right, and pH being the critical one, I would say, to start off with, we turned the nitrogen use efficiency around straight up. And this is more to the point, we can't operate at a lower soil fertility and expect to get high efficiency. You're only masking a hidden hunger in the soil, and by putting on more nitrogen, more of that nitrogen proportionally is going to the environment. Soil pH, critical for clover establishment. This is a little bit of work there that was done just in terms of clover establishment. In the first year after that clover was established, and you can see there where the soil pH in particular was increased up to the sweet spot for clover, higher level, 6.8 there. We were getting much higher cumulative dry matter year yield for a part of the year, so probably only for 6-7 months of the year in this newly reseeded sward. And you can see there we were maximizing that by increasing the pH. Where the pH was low, that clover wasn't obviously establishing, but also wasn't fixing any nitrogen even within that first year for the sward. So it is critical there in terms of having pH, in terms of getting into clover. And Mike Egan will talk a little bit more about the clover itself and what opportunity that gives in the next series. So on to some key messages. Soil fertility management is the cornerstone, I would say, for sustainable production. We think about our soils and soils in Ireland being the bedrock of agriculture. We pride ourselves on our soils and how productive they are, how good we are at grassland management, etc. But soil fertility has to come back into vogue in terms of being part of that. Policy signals lower maximum available nitrogen on farms in the future. And in that, we need to protect our family farm model by careful management of nitrogen and phosphorus. If we don't do that, then our production potential will be eroded in terms of cutting stocking rate or further constraints on farmers through regulation to achieve the environmental goals. So we need to look up and consider that as a risk to the farming business. Know our number is a key thing. We have a know our number for many things nowadays. But know your number in terms of nitrogen use efficiency is going to be critical in terms of meeting these objectives. And there's many useful objectives or useful calculations in terms of fertiliser use efficiency, the managed fertiliser use efficiency, or the total nitrogen use efficiency on the farm, or ultimately the surplus, the balance. Balanced fertility is a key enabler, I would say, to transition to lower nitrogen use. So we have to get the soil fertility right to be able to throttle back confidently in terms of nitrogen fertiliser and still feed our animals and reach our production goals. And lastly, I would say we can't sit on our hands any longer. Significant and immediate action or engagement by all stakeholders is required to meet this. So look, with that, I'll stop and I'm happy to answer any questions.
David, that's great. Some fantastic information, a lot of good science there, a lot to take in that presentation. Look, there's plenty of questions as you can imagine. But I suppose I'll just, before I hand over to Seamus to ask a few questions, I just ask one myself there. At the start of the presentation, you spoke about all the different targets that are there. Excuse me. The 20% farm to fork, the NAP 10% and possibly another 5%, the food vision 22 to 25%, all looking to reduce nitrogen. And I suppose what which is the one that we should be working towards, or what's your take on it, David?
Yeah, look at
working towards them all.
I suppose look at there. Some of those targets are at a different time scales. But if we look at the early target, the signals in terms of the NAP, the 10% cut that we've had, the potential for a further, that's getting us up to about 15% cut. By 2025, there is a target for that 20% already. And then obviously if we think about the climate targets, they're to bring us from roughly 400,000 tonnes down to 300,000 tonnes. So that's a 25% cut or a 30% cut, which you could say was achieved because of price signals in the last year. We were down to about 285,000 tonnes from the heights of around 400,000 tonnes in 2018. Now, can we sustain that? Can grass production, what's the effect of having that? Anecdotal evidence would say that grass yields have fallen somewhat. And you'd have to look into that and ponder a little bit. Were those on the soils that had low soil fertility? As Pat has quite rightly stated there, we have an impending prices coming down the tracks because of the lack of P&K use in the last couple of years. Our only saving grace on that is, as I've showed there, pH is a critical switch, and we have done some heavy lifting there. So we can turn this around, but we can't, I suppose, ignore it in 2024, even though prices are relatively high. There's pressure on farms there, etc.
Yeah.
But we need to look at that.
No, let me come in there. I think the one other, if you go back to farm to fork, I think they were very insightful. They asked for a 20% reduction in fertilizer use and a 50% reduction in the impact. And that's where we're now starting. If we can keep the nitrogen reduction, we're at the 20%. But the next question is, can we get the 50% reduction in greenhouse gases, a 50% reduction in ammonia, and a 50% reduction in losses to water? And that's where the real heavy lifting is from here on in.
Yeah, no, I agree. Seamus,
there as well, Noel, just to follow on from David and Pat, we've done the heavy lifting in relation to lifting pH and lime, and very importantly that we don't just say that we've the job done now. I think we're going to have to maintain that huge increase in lime application that's gone on the last couple of years and keep that moving, because soil pH is the key here. Get that right first. That's the first and main message we have to get out there. It'll help increase nutrient efficiency of both N, P, and K. And that's a lot of the questions that were coming in there about soil lower P indices, etc. If we get the lime out, get the pH right. David, interesting. I was looking at your slide there on clover. You had 6.8. Is kind of, I don't know whether that's a target or where we should be hitting for on that.
Well,
if we're looking at clover making an impact in reducing our nitrogen application, we need to be hitting for 6.5, 6.6 probably of a pH target for those soils.
Yeah, and look at, for a bit of comfort there, if you're on a 3 or 4 year alignment plan, you probably need to push it up a little bit with that. The other piece of work that I haven't shown there, as we get up to that 6.6 plus 6.7, 6.8, we're getting 40% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions on those higher lime soils. So there's a key, it's a win-win-win. Win in terms of nitrogen use efficiency in your pocket, in terms of return on investment, a win in terms of production, in terms of quantity of production, yield, etc., and a win in terms of the environment. And it's a technology that is as cheap as chips.
And like, I mean, the science is beyond reproach. Like, and the work that you did with Philip Murphy there, one of your last slides, excellent stuff. But we're still not. How do we get this to application? It's the old nugget that we're having trouble getting by. Like, we have the science to show this is sound, but to get it on the ground is a challenge, and we still haven't cracked that conundrum yet, I'd say.
No, look at my personal, and this is a personal opinion, I suppose, is that this stuff is not sexy. It's old. However, when we look at it, when we do the research and we look at it, 99% of the efficiency gains, etc., is got with the basics. So we can add on, more sexy stuff or tools and technologies, we can get into, and I'm not knocking these tools now or whatever, machinery, variable rate, etc. Those will give advantages and get more precision. There's no doubt about it. But 99% of it is still got with the basics. I suppose we need to engage the generation that's out there farming at the moment. They probably grew up in an era where all this technological advancement came on, and that does. It certainly catches my mind, it catches my eye, and I'll move towards it. However, we must not forget the basics here, and the basics will actually pay the big bucks, and with the change now towards the targets and that brake being put on agriculture, if we don't get focused on this and do it for all the right reasons, all the agronomic reasons, etc., and those advantages, the brakes will be put on agriculture even more, and that would be a bit of a travesty, because we live in a very productive part of the world. We have a huge capacity to grow very sustainably food, and to reduce that wouldn't be good globally from a climate perspective. But we just have to change and bend a little bit and move in a way that we're doing things in a more considered manner.
Okay, so listen, we're approaching 11:40, which was when we were due to finish, but we're going to add another 10 minutes to it because there's a number of questions after coming in that we haven't gotten to it all yet. And Seamus, you might rattle through a few of those, and if you can, keep your answers maybe as brief as possible. So, Seamus.
Okay, thanks, Noel. So maybe, and I think David has kind of touched on this maybe a little bit already, but for Pat, I suppose, you spoke a bit about the fertiliser use in 2022 and 2023, and it was obviously has reduced. Is it a view that this is price driven, or is it a long-term trend? And also maybe then as a follow-on from that, with the reduction in the P&K use, has there been any visible reduction in grass production as a result?
Yeah, I think there's no question the main issue 22 and 23 was a combination of price and availability, and I suppose it's a direction of travel we were trying to go in, and it has sped us up on that, and will be a very significant challenge to even hold. The levels that we got to in 23 are a little bit unreal because there was a carryover. So, but I think people have learned that we can operate with a little bit lower level of nitrogen use. So hopefully we'll be able to maintain the majority of it. Second half, in terms of the
grass production.
The grass production, talking to our colleagues in dairy and beef, and looking at the figures coming from the pasture base, there was a reduction in the level of grass growth, particularly last year. There was a reduction there. So the challenge is to get that back up to where it was with the lower levels of nitrogen.
Okay, and just finally then for you, Pat, maybe. Sorry, go on, Tim.
Pat's comment there about the reduction in grass growth last year. We must remember that last year was a difficult grass growing year. So how much of it is attributed to a drop in soil fertility is hard to say. Well, it's 50 or 60 or 70% or all, but definitely the weather conditions last year had an impact on it.
Okay. So finally, then maybe I suppose it's a question you might find it hard to answer. But when will we finally know the N allowances for 2024 for farmers?
Don't know how to answer it once, lads.
So,
Well, I'll come
Maybe
in first.
David, maybe. Yeah, go on.
Well, David can come in next, but where it's coming from, I say the question is coming from is the NMP online. When will we have the fertiliser allowances correct in that to match what's maybe going to be in the nitrox action plan in a number of weeks or months' time? So, David, I don't know if you can answer that one.
yeah, look,
It's
it's my understanding that there will be a public consultation. There has to be with any new nitrates or post review. We'd expect that public consultation to happen fairly imminently, and the question will be then, what the level of reduction will be. Will it be, as was stated in the last NAP, will it be the 5%? And then the next big question is, when will it be implemented? And it's my understanding that from a water quality perspective and trying to, I suppose, make a good argument to protect the derogation going forward, that it will want to be implemented this year as soon as possible. So that's a tough one to plan and that kind of thing, but we don't know any more than that.
Okay. So Tim, maybe then, in the context of the simple NMP plan that you did, you mentioned the high organic matter soils layer. I suppose maybe what additional checks need to be made in relation to this when you're doing the NMP plan?
So one of the questions coming in there is how accurate is that?
Yes, and that's another question as well. Yeah.
And David might have a bit of a follow on from this answer, but the organic matter layer is an indicative layer. It's to indicate where, with all the background information you have within the Teagasc soils database, EPA layers, etc., that this part of the farm or this part of the field may be in the high organic matter layer. That's an indicator to say, yes, it could be. The only way to really find it out is to do an organic matter test of that area as part of your soil sampling process. And one of the things that we are seeing is that advisors and merchants who are selling fertilizer, maybe doing soil samples as part of a program for a dairy co-op or whatever, they are now starting to take more organic matter samples. We see a huge number of them coming in from Teagasc advisors, and it's giving us a more definitive answer as to what the organic matter percentage is. Now, when we talk about this indicative layer, it's where you have more than 20% organic matter in the soil. Okay. I would say probably 50-60% of the soils that are tested for organic matter are showing they are above the 20%. So it's only indicative. Now, I wouldn't have the exact figures from our own soils database, but what we are finding is that advisors are taking soil samples from those areas specifically, because a soil sample shouldn't be taken from a mineral soil and a peat soil and mixed in the same box. Easy said when you're out in the office, but when you're out on the ground, those maps are there as an indicative layer of where the high organic matter soils could be.
I suppose then, Tim, in relation to the some lands are showing up under the organic matter layer on the NMP system. Where is that layer coming from, maybe? And can it be corrected, I suppose, if they're showing up incorrectly as high organic matter soils? I suppose the only way to correct is to prove that they're not organic matter soils by testing them. But in terms of maybe where's the layer coming from?
David, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I'll come in on that one. So the layer is a map layer, and between the different scales of the maps, 1 is to 250,000, etc., it's not going to be accurate on a parcel level. So as Tim says, it's indicative. And where it won't be really accurate is on the border, on the transition zone, where the line is on the edge of the map. So you could be fairly confident that if you're in the peat layer, you're probably well in it. It's the areas along the edge of that map because of the scale of the map. So, there's not that fine resolution in terms of the scale, and it's only indicative. So as you say, Seamus, yourself, you prove that you're not in it is the way to go. Okay.
So David, you might as well stay on the stage there now. A few questions for you. So there's a couple of questions in there in relation to the the nitrogen allowance, I suppose, if you're at between 170 and 210, you get an allowance of 254. If you're over that, you get 225. Can you explain that?
Okay, right. So this is based on the response curve. So there's two things going on here. There's nitrates limits and there's the grass response curve. So if we think about the grass response curve coming up and begins to fall off at the top level, and you think about production potential of grass, 500 kilograms of nitrogen is probably up there in terms of what you would need to grow a hell of a lot of grass, right? So that comes from different sources. Obviously, there's 4 or 5 tons grown from the soil. The next bit then is from the returns from the stock, so recycled nitrogen that goes in through the animal, it's ingested by the animal, and it comes out in dung and urine. And then the last bit is the top up with fertiliser or reapplied slurry in that. So if we think about that and grass being responsive up to around 500 kilograms, nitrates adopted 500 kilograms as a total in terms of what you could put in. So in terms of the 254 at 110, there's not as much coming in from the stock. So if we think about 250 from fertiliser plus 250 from livestock returns or organic manure, that was the 500 in the past. If we work then, if you're at 210, you don't have as much from the stock, so you're allowed more from the fertiliser. And that's where the higher level came from. However, both are being moderated down now. If you're down at 220 or if you're down at 225, we'll say in terms of your maximum fertiliser allowance, both of those will begin to come down. And we're now, for both categories, not achieving 500 kilograms in terms of total returned and inputted when you add the two of them together. So very soon that will begin to have an impact on production potential. If you weren't substituting with low emission slurry spreading and getting more from the slurry or clover or getting your soil fertility right, that will begin to hurt going forward.
Okay. So in relation to nutrient use efficiency or nitrogen use efficiency, David, there's 3 questions there, I suppose, and I'll ask you the 3 of them together. The first one is Irish research around combining humic acid as a vehicle to increase NUE? Where is Irish research in relation to combining humic acid? Right. The other one is, does breaking up the hard pan have a significant effect on nutrient use efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency? And the third one then is the application of biofertilizers. Can this assist in increasing NUE?
Okay, very good questions. Especially with the soils and soils directive or soil health law coming down the tracks. All these things come in very much. First one I'll deal with, I'll jump to the second one first, just because the other two are in the same vein. So the hard pan and any level of compaction is going to have a big effect on nitrogen use efficiency. Number one, it's going to affect or impede root architecture and root growth. And root, I suppose, foraging for nutrients in the layer. If there's a pan closer to the surface, that impedes both air and root growth, but also then the movement of those nutrients around in the soil where they can be stored temporarily for longer term use. So certainly, breaking a pan through, I would say, better management would be the main thing. I wouldn't be going with a subsoiler straight away, because you actually may do more damage than good with that. But that's number one. In terms of the humic acid or the biofert, humic acid, we have work ongoing and have done work on humic acids in the past. What I would say, humic acids have shown good effect in research in environments with low carbon, right? We're not that environment. So if you think about the Mediterranean as a good example, very hot in a tillage situation, especially down in the Mediterranean, you're going to burn off all your labile organic matter. And something like a humic acid or another form of carbon that you put into the soil is going to trigger soil biology in that situation because they're starved under that. In our system, in our environment, because of the rainfall and everything else, we're loaded with labile organic matter. So in the research, humic acids are having a much less effect, if any effect, in our environment, especially in grassland, because there's so much labile soil organic matter. So I'm not saying humic acids don't work. It's context specific. Biofert is another one. So Biofert has carbon in it. Obviously, it's made from an organic source, whatever the source is. And certainly, Biofert, because it has carbon there, it can trigger better mineralization, better uptake. It also probably has P and K in it, as well as the nitrogen, and you get co-transport of those nutrients when they're packaged together. So yeah, so look at it. All those things can help in terms of rejuvenate a soil, especially if it's a worn soil.
Okay, so go on, Noel, yeah.
No, go on if you've
Yeah, look at one more question. I suppose maybe it's two-pronged one again, just a quick one. The impacts, I suppose, of the excessive rainfall that we've been having recently on soil fertility, and maybe I suppose a comment then on the effects of clover, given that clover produces, I suppose, an equivalent amount of nitrogen as chemical N. Will it also cause the same nitrate problems?
That's for me, Seamus, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of the first one, in terms of rainfall, yes, rainfall will have some of an effect. So rainfall is an extractant in its own right. If you think about it as a soil test, you bring in your soil, you put an extractant into it, you shake it, and you get the nutrients out of it, and then you analyze what nutrients you got out. Water is an extractant in its own right. Mightn't be like the Morgan's test or whatever else. So it will extract some nutrients out of the soil and flush them out of it. So it will have an effect to some degree. In terms of lime, probably flushing more lime than it will phosphorus is fairly tightly bound. And potash, we've just done a study there, a PhD student, Thomas McCarthy, looking at K leaching in the back end. And over the last couple of years, especially last year, we got significant K leaching from lighter soils. So it will have an effect, maybe not as much of an effect as lack of putting it in there in the first place. In terms of the third one, just in the interest of time there on clover, the key with clover is supplying nitrogen according to grass growth. Right, so it works in the back end, in the second end of the year. So from April onwards, I would say clover begins to come into its own, but it's grown in unison with the grass. So it's drip feeding in nitrogen there with the grass, which has a high potential uptake. It's not like it's putting out a split; it's putting it in every day, according to grass growth and taking its cues from growing days. The issue with clover, and where clover can lead to a problem, just like a surplus can lead to a problem, mismanagement of nutrients or not putting the slurry where it needs to go. If you don't throttle back with the nitrogen, you still put in the same amount of fertiliser and slurry, and you take the extra nitrogen with clover, of course you're going to run into a surplus situation. So clover is not the enemy here. It's more so how you're managing the clover, and are you prepared to go a little bit cold turkey in terms of throttling back with the fertiliser and not having a surplus there at the end of the year. That's the key.
Okay, that's it.
Okay.
Tim has his hand up there.
We're one last comment, now we're going to wrap
follow
up.
up on that.
Yeah.
David, I think it's important to emphasize the importance of taking good quality soil samples.
Yep.
And, making sure that we take enough cores, we take them in the right spots, we don't mix up soil types, and we get the depth right in the soil cores. And then 100%. You get good soil results back.
Yeah, no, very, very important point, Tim, because you actually inflate your results. You get a false positive if the core is not going down. We've calibrated our soil tests to 10 centimeters because it takes out the stratification of nutrients in the top of that 10 centimeters that would be very rich and will give you a false positive. But most of the plant roots are actually growing under that root mat. So again, it is critically important that we take 10 centimeters because all the calibrations are done on that.
Okay, good stuff, folks. We've gone over time, and apologies to the viewers on the webinar today or on the conference today. But there was a lot of good questions there, and thanks to Seamus for asking them, and to the three lads for answering them. So well done, everybody. And I just want to thank a few people before we wrap up. Obviously, I want to thank all the people who joined us this morning. We appreciate you being online and all the interaction. I hope you found it useful. I want to thank the speakers, Dr. David Wall, Tim Hyde, and Pat Murphy for giving good presentations, and to Seamus Nolan for helping out with the questions. I want to thank Yvonne Maher in the background, who, as always, has organised the conference without any fuss and has delivered excellently, as always. And I just want to share next week we have. One second, I'll get rid of this out of the way. Next week, we have 3 more speakers lined up. So at the same time, we have Dr. Seamus Carney looking at minimising costs and environmental impact of your fertiliser rain programme. Then we have Dr. Patrick Forrester looking at nitrogen formulation and sulphur. I think sulphur is a very important part with regards to nitrogen. And then we get right into the clover nitrogen use and production with Dr. Michael Egan. So I hope you can all make it next week. And thanks for your time, and have a good rest of your day for Monday. So everybody, goodbye now. Thank you.